In 2026, the gemstone market is doing something most people will miss. The stones getting the most attention online are not the stones serious collectors are quietly buying, because collectors do not chase what looks expensive. They chase what becomes hard to replace and easy to recognize as real. Right now, three forces are reshaping collector demand. High-grade supply is tightening, treatment transparency is becoming non-negotiable, and collector taste is shifting away from prestige toward performance. That is why 2026 is not being defined by the loudest gemstones. It is being defined by the gemstones that do something undeniable. A stone that throws more fire than diamond. A stone that changes color without asking permission. A stone that looks simple until a loop reveals why it is quietly disappearing into private collections. And one gemstone on this list, ranked number 1, has a trait so visually obvious that it doesn't require gem knowledge at all. It creates belief in a single second. This countdown is a documentary look at 10 gemstones collectors are quietly buying in 2026, not as speculation, not as hype, and not as financial advice, but as a clear view into what happens when supply cannot scale and demand becomes smarter. When a gemstone enters a serious collection, what matters more long-term? The name everyone recognizes, or the trait no other stone can copy? Because that one answer explains almost everything in 2026. Let's begin. Ranked 10th, Spessartite Garnet. The orange gem collectors don't talk about, they just buy. In the gemstone world, orange has always been treated like a secondary color, not as powerful as ruby red, not as authoritative as sapphire blue, and not as culturally iconic as emerald green. But that is exactly why Spessartite Garnet, better known in the collector world as Mandarin Garnet, is quietly gaining strength in 2026. This is not a gemstone that creates loud headlines. It doesn't rely on royal mythology. It doesn't come with a famous lost mine story. And it rarely shows up in the mainstream jewelry conversation. What makes it dangerous in the collector sense is something far more simple. Its best color looks unreal. At high quality, Mandarin Garnet carries a saturated orange that feels almost impossible in a natural stone. Under proper lighting, it doesn't just reflect light, it appears to ignite. Some stones show a pure citrus orange. Others lean into a glowing sunset tone with a hint of red. And the rarest examples display a neon-like intensity that makes the gem look internally lit. And here's the part most people misunderstand. Spessartite is not rare because the mineral is rare. It's rare because the quality is rare. Spessartite can be found in multiple locations, but true collector-grade material, stones with strong saturation, high clarity, excellent cutting, and no heavy darkening, is limited. Namibia helped define the classic Mandarin look. Nigeria and Mozambique have produced striking material as well, but the top-tier stones do not appear consistently. That creates a special kind of scarcity. The category exists, but the best version of it cannot scale. And in 2026, that matters more than ever. Collectors are shifting away from gemstones that require long explanations, complicated treatment debates, or heavy origin politics. Instead, many are quietly prioritizing stones that deliver three things immediately: instant visual identity, high aesthetic impact without needing a lecture, low controversy around treatment and disclosure. Mandarin Garnet fits that shift perfectly. Unlike emerald, which often requires conversations about oiling, or sapphire, where heating becomes part of the value equation, spessartite is generally judged in a more straightforward way. What the buyer sees is usually what the stone is. That honesty is increasingly valuable to collectors in the 40 to 65 range, especially those who prefer stability over drama. But the most interesting factor is psychological. Mandarin Garnet is the kind of gemstone collectors tend to buy quietly. Not because it's unknown, but because it's not a stone people buy to show off knowledge. It's a stone people buy to keep. And whenever a gemstone triggers that kind of behavior, keep it, don't talk about it. It usually enters a long, steady phase of collector accumulation. There's also a second layer of demand building behind the scenes: replacement psychology. As the top tiers of ruby, sapphire, and emerald continue to stretch upward in price, the market naturally searches for gemstones that still deliver strong color impact without entering six-figure territory. Mandarin garnet is one of the few stones that can hold its own visually next to the major classics, while still feeling like a collector's secret. If you had to choose one orange gemstone for long-term collecting, what would matter more, the most intense color or the cleanest clarity? That answer usually reveals whether someone collects emotionally or technically. Spessartite garnet ranks at number 10 not because it's small. It ranks here because it's consistently underestimated until someone sees a truly exceptional stone in person. And once they do, it becomes very difficult to forget. Next up, a gemstone that collectors respect not because it's flashy, but because it's one of the toughest, most quietly reliable stones in the entire gem world. Ranked 9th, Chrysoprase, the collector's gem that never needed hype. Most people only learn the name Chrysoprase through one dramatic doorway: alexandrite, a gemstone famous for changing color, famous for auction headlines, famous for being almost impossible to find in high quality. But that creates a blind spot, because long before alexandrite became a status stone, Chrysoprase itself was already one of the most important collector gems on Earth. Quietly respected for a reason that has nothing to do with hype. It is one of the most structurally reliable gemstones in the entire market. Chrysoprase sits at 8.5 on the Mohs scale, making it harder than most mainstream gemstones people wear every day. It is tougher than garnet, tougher than tourmaline, tougher than tanzanite, and far more resistant to daily wear than many stones that sell for far more money. And in 2026, that kind of durability is not just a technical detail. It is becoming a form of value, because collectors are increasingly splitting into two categories: those who collect gemstones as display pieces and those who collect gemstones as objects meant to last through decades of real ownership. Non-alexandrite chrysoprase is one of the rare stones that satisfies both. At first glance, it can look deceptively simple. Most fine chrysoprase appears in shades of warm yellow, honey gold, olive, or greenish gold. Not neon, not electric, not the kind of color that screams for attention in a jewelry case. But that is exactly what makes it collector grade. Chrysoprase has a visual quality that many gemstones struggle to achieve: density. Its color doesn't look painted on the surface. It looks embedded inside the crystal, like the stone has weight, not just physically but visually. Under a loupe, high-quality chrysoprase often shows exceptional clarity and clean internal structure. When properly cut, it produces a crisp brilliance that feels controlled and precise. It doesn't sparkle wildly like Sphene. It doesn't flash like diamond. It shines in a way that looks intentional, and that aesthetic appeals strongly to the U.S. collector mindset, especially in the 45 to 65 age range, because this audience tends to trust gemstones that don't feel like they're trying too hard. Now here is where 2026 becomes especially interesting. Chrysoprase is quietly benefiting from the same forces driving demand in Sapphire and Sphene: treatment transparency and long-term stability. Unlike many stones where enhancement debates can complicate value, fine chrysoprase is often traded with far fewer layers of controversy. It is not a stone that requires a long explanation of what was done to it. The market evaluates it primarily through the fundamentals: color clarity, cutting size, and overall presence. That simplicity matters, because when collectors feel uncertain about categories that depend heavily on treatment disclosure, they rotate into stones that feel easier to verify and easier to trust. And trust is one of the most underpriced forces in the gemstone world. There is also a subtle collector psychology at play. Chrysoprase is a gemstone that signals knowledge without needing to be loud. A ruby announces itself instantly. A paraiba announces itself instantly. But Chrysoprase is the stone someone buys when they already understand the market. It is not a starter gem. It is a second phase gem. The kind of stone that enters a collection after someone has already owned the obvious classics and starts looking for what holds up quietly. When collecting gemstones, which matters more long-term, visual impact or structural durability? Most people choose impact until they've owned enough stones to understand why durability becomes a form of rarity. Chrysoprase ranks at number 9 because it represents something that is becoming more valuable in 2026. A gemstone that doesn't need marketing, doesn't need mythology, and doesn't need trend cycles to stay relevant. It is simply built to last. Next up, a stone most people confuse with a fake, even though it is one of the most brilliant natural gems ever mined. Ranked 8th, natural zircon, the gem most people misjudge until they see it. There are very few gemstones in the world that can embarrass a diamond in pure optical performance. Natural zircon is one of them. And that statement alone explains why collectors are quietly buying it in 2026, while the mainstream market still misunderstands it. Because zircon suffers from one of the worst identity problems in the entire gem trade. Most people hear the word zircon and immediately think of cubic zirconia, a lab-made imitation, a cheap substitute, a stone associated with costume jewelry. But natural zircon is not cubic zirconia, not even close. Natural zircon is a real mineral, formed in the earth, often billions of years old. In fact, some of the oldest known minerals ever discovered on Earth are zircons. That alone makes it one of the most historically significant gemstones a person can own. Yet in the jewelry world, its reputation has been buried under a name collision. And in 2026, collectors love categories like this. Because when a gemstone is visually powerful but culturally underestimated, it creates a rare opportunity. A stone can be objectively excellent, while still being psychologically mispriced. Zircon's defining advantage is something gemologists call dispersion, the splitting of white light into spectral color. In plain terms, dispersion is the fire people associate with diamonds, and zircon has it in abundance. A well-cut zircon doesn't just sparkle, it throws flashes of color, blue, green, orange, red, like a miniature prism. Under strong lighting, it can look almost unreal. But zircon isn't just fire, it also has a second trait that makes it collector grade. It has presence. Unlike some stones that look thin or watery when they're light in color, zircon tends to show a heavier optical density. Even pale stones feel substantial. Even small stones can feel important. And that matters in 2026 because collectors are increasingly choosing gems that perform well on camera and in person, without needing size inflation. Now here's the shift happening behind the scenes. Collectors are starting to treat zircon the way they treat other corrected identity gemstones. Spinel went through this. Tourmaline went through this. Even Sapphire went through this, in the sense that buyers learned to separate heated from unheated. Zircon is now going through the same correction, not because the stone changed, because perception is finally catching up. There's also a durability nuance that serious collectors understand. Zircon is reasonably hard, but it is not as tough as sapphire. That means it benefits from careful setting and thoughtful use. But collectors don't see that as a weakness. They see it as a signal. Because the stones that require respect tend to end up in the hands of owners who actually understand what they're buying. And that creates a collector loop. The people buying zircon in 2026 are not casual buyers. They are informed buyers. And informed buyers tend to hold rather than flip. Color matters too. While blue zircon dominates the commercial market, collector attention often moves toward high-quality colorless zircon, diamond-like fire, warm honey or champagne tones, and especially well-cut stones with clean brilliance. But the most important factor is still the same. Zircon is one of the few gemstones that delivers top-tier optics without top-tier social hype. And in collecting, that combination is extremely rare. Which matters more in a gemstone? Reputation, or what the stone actually does under light? Because zircon is a perfect test of that question. Natural zircon ranks at number 8 because it represents one of the most fascinating collector patterns in 2026. A gemstone that has always been extraordinary, but is only now being taken seriously. And when perception changes in gemstones, value rarely jumps loudly. It rises quietly through accumulation. Next up, a gemstone that behaves like alexandrite's younger cousin, a real phenomenon stone that collectors are buying before it becomes obvious. Ranked 7th, color change garnet, the phenomenon gem collectors buy before the crowd understands it. In the gemstone world, there are two kinds of rarity. The first is the obvious kind. A gemstone is rare because it's difficult to find. The second is more powerful. A gemstone is rare because most people don't know what they're looking at. That is exactly where color change garnet sits in 2026. It is one of the most quietly accumulated gemstones in serious collections, not because it's trendy and not because it's famous, but because it offers something collectors always chase, a real optical phenomenon that can't be faked with storytelling. Color change garnet does something that instantly separates it from ordinary stones. Under daylight or cool lighting, it can appear green, teal, bluish green, or even grayish blue. But under warm, incandescent light, it shifts, often into raspberry, purplish red, or wine tones. And the key word here is shift, not a slight change, not a hint, a real noticeable transformation. This is why collectors treat it as a phenomenon stone, similar in spirit to alexandrite, but occupying a completely different market lane. Because while alexandrite is one of the most expensive and mythologized gems in the world, color change garnet remains strangely overlooked. And that is precisely what makes it collector grade in 2026. This gemstone has no mainstream identity. It is not pushed in jewelry chains. It is not a birthstone people grow up hearing about. It doesn't have a royal narrative or a celebrity endorsement. So when someone owns a fine color change garnet, it doesn't signal trend. It signals knowledge. And that matters in collector psychology, especially in the US 30 to 65 demographic, where the highest status signal is often not expensive, but informed. Another reason collectors are quietly buying this stone is structural. The best color change garnets are not scalable. Garnet is a broad family with many varieties, and because of that, people assume supply is endless. But true color change material, stones with strong saturation, good clarity, and a dramatic attractive shift, is a narrow phenomenon inside a huge mineral group. It's not like mining red garnet and sorting it. It requires the right chemistry under the right geological conditions. And when those conditions appear, they don't appear consistently. That creates what collectors call a compression market. A lot of stones exist, but only a small fraction qualify as real. And in 2026, collectors are becoming more selective about what real means. They are prioritizing stones that can be demonstrated, not explained. Color change garnet is the kind of gemstone that proves itself in seconds. No debate, no argument, no long lecture about origin politics or treatment tiers. Just a light change, and suddenly the stone becomes something else. This also makes it one of the most powerful gemstones for storytelling and display. A collector can show it to someone with zero gem knowledge and still create an immediate reaction. The phenomenon is accessible, even if the category is not, and that accessibility gives it a unique advantage in the long-term collector ecosystem. It creates memory. Many gemstones are beautiful, but only a few are unforgettable. Color change garnet is unforgettable because it behaves like a living object. There is also a treatment factor worth noting. Unlike many gemstones where heat treatment or clarity enhancement becomes a major value divider, color change garnet is often traded with fewer layers of controversy. The value is primarily in the natural strength of the change, the beauty of the two colors, and the overall quality of the cut. That simplicity makes it easier to trust. And when trust increases in a category, collectors accumulate. Quietly. If a gemstone can change color in real life, does that make it more valuable than a stone that is simply rare? Because collectors often disagree on that, and the answer reveals how someone thinks about value. Color change garnet ranks at number 7 because it sits in a very rare position in the 2026 market. A phenomenon stone with real performance that still hasn't become a mainstream obsession. And when collectors find a category like that, they don't advertise it, they buy it. Next up, a sapphire category most people don't even realize exists, and it's quietly reshaping what collector sapphire means in 2026. Ranked 6th, fancy sapphire. The sapphire shift that's redefining collector taste. For decades, sapphire collecting followed a predictable hierarchy. Blue was king, royal blue, cornflower blue, deep velvety blue. Those were the colors that carried authority. Everything else was treated as secondary, interesting, decorative, but not truly collector. That hierarchy is changing in 2026, And the change is not being driven by casual buyers. It is being driven by collectors. Because collectors don't just chase what is traditionally valuable, they chase what is becoming culturally meaningful. And right now, the sapphire world is quietly moving toward a new center of gravity: fancy sapphires, especially teal, party, and yellow-orange tones. These stones are not alternatives to blue sapphire. They are becoming a category of their own. The reason is simple: they look like nothing else. A fine teal sapphire can hold both blue and green in the same body color, creating a moody ocean tone that feels modern but timeless. A party sapphire can display multiple colors inside a single stone, often blue and yellow or green and gold, creating a natural split that looks almost designed. And yellow-orange sapphires occupy an entirely different psychological lane: warmth, light, and rarity without aggression. These are not loud gemstones. They are intelligent gemstones. And that is why they are rising in collector attention in 2026. There is also a market factor most people overlook. Blue sapphire has become so standardized that collectors have started looking for personality. In the high end, blue sapphire is still powerful. But in the mid to upper collector range, buyers are increasingly fatigued by the same repeated language: royal, cornflower, velvet, cashmere style. Those descriptors still matter, but they don't feel new. Fancy sapphires feel new without being synthetic, trendy, or unstable. They are a natural evolution of collector taste. Another force accelerating this shift is the modern obsession with authenticity. Fancy sapphires often show subtle internal zoning, color transitions, and natural quirks that would have been rejected decades ago. Today, those quirks are being reframed as proof of natural origin, like brushstrokes in a painting. Collectors are no longer demanding perfection that looks manufactured. They are demanding character that looks geological. And fancy sapphire delivers that character in a way few gemstones can. But the most important reason this category is quietly strengthening in 2026 is structural. The best fancy sapphires are extremely difficult to repeat. Teal and party sapphires are not simply blue sapphires with different lighting. They are the result of trace element chemistry that creates complex color zoning during crystal growth. That means even stones from the same region can look completely different. No two fine party sapphires are truly identical. And in collecting, uniqueness is a form of rarity that often outperforms simple scarcity. There is also a treatment and documentation advantage. While sapphire is frequently heat-treated, collectors in 2026 are placing growing premiums on unheated status, clear laboratory documentation, and stones that retain natural complexity rather than being pushed toward uniformity. A teal or party sapphire that remains unheated and well-cut can feel like the perfect intersection of sapphire durability, collector credibility, and modern aesthetic identity. That intersection is rare, and it's exactly where quiet buying tends to happen. The jewelry world is also amplifying this shift. Designers are increasingly choosing teal and party sapphires for engagement rings, heirloom-style pieces, and modern collector jewelry. That matters because it creates cultural visibility without creating mass hype. Collectors love categories that become desirable without becoming flooded. If sapphire is the same mineral, what matters more in collecting? The classic color everyone recognizes, or the rare color that feels impossible to duplicate? Because that question is shaping the sapphire market right now. Fancy sapphire ranks at number 6 because it represents a very specific 2026 trend. Not a trend of fashion, a trend of taste, a shift away from uniform prestige toward geological individuality. Next up, a gemstone that produces some of the most violent fire ever seen in a natural stone, and yet most people have never even heard its name. Ranked 5th, Sphene, the gem with more fire than diamond, and almost no one talks about it. There is a moment that happens to almost every serious gemstone collector at some point. A gemstone is placed under light. It flashes, and for a second, the person looking at it stops thinking in categories. Not ruby, not sapphire, not emerald. Just, what is that? That moment is exactly why Sphene, also known as titanite, is quietly being bought in 2026 by collectors who understand optical performance. Because Sphene has one trait that immediately separates it from almost everything else in the gem world. Its fire can be stronger than diamond. In gemology, that fire is called dispersion, the splitting of white light into spectral colors. Diamond is famous for it. It is the reason diamonds look alive under bright light. But Sphene? Sphene can throw dispersion so aggressively that it looks almost exaggerated. A well-cut Sphene doesn't just sparkle. It produces flashes of green, yellow, orange, and red, like a prism trapped inside a gemstone. And here's the part that makes it even more collector grade. Sphene is not common in jewelry, not because it isn't beautiful, but because the category has always been limited by something most buyers never think about. The best Sphene is extremely hard to find in clean, durable, gem-quality form. This is not a mass-market stone. Sphene is relatively soft compared to sapphire and diamond, which means it requires careful handling and thoughtful setting. But collectors don't view that as a weakness. They view it as a filter, because gemstones that demand respect tend to end up in the hands of people who actually know what they are doing. And in 2026, that collector behavior matters. Collectors are quietly rotating into stones that meet a very specific requirement. They must look extraordinary on camera and in real life without needing size or brand recognition. Sphene fits that perfectly. Even a 1-carat stone can look larger than it is because the dispersion creates visual chaos, controlled chaos. The stone appears to be throwing light in multiple directions at once. It feels energetic, almost electric, but in a natural mineralogical way. And unlike many neon stones, Sphene's color itself is often sophisticated. Fine Sphene can appear yellow-green, chartreuse, olive, golden, or even slightly brownish. Some collectors prefer the greener material because it looks more unusual. Others prefer warmer golden tones because they feel more classical. But regardless of body color, the fire remains the defining feature. Now, the reason Sphene ranks this high in 2026 is not just beauty. It's scarcity in the exact place collectors care about most. High-performance quality. Many gemstones exist in large quantities, but only a small percentage perform at the level collectors want. With Sphene, that percentage becomes even smaller because the stone must meet several requirements at once: strong dispersion, good transparency, minimal visible inclusions, stable, attractive body color, and a cut that maximizes fire without turning the stone dark. When all of that aligns, the result is not a pretty gem. It becomes a spectacle. And spectacles are always collected. There is also a psychological advantage to Sphene that is rarely discussed. Sphene is a gemstone that makes experienced collectors feel like they have discovered something. Even when the stone is real and documented, most people still don't know it exists. That creates a special kind of ownership satisfaction, one that doesn't rely on social validation. It relies on personal certainty. And that is exactly what drives quiet buying. In a market where many categories have become saturated with hype, Sphene feels like a reminder of what gemstones were always supposed to be: natural miracles of optics and geology. If a gemstone outperforms diamond in fire, does it deserve more respect, even if it isn't as durable? Because that question divides collectors into two camps: performance first and longevity first. Sphene ranks at number 5 because it represents one of the strongest collector patterns in 2026. A stone with outrageous beauty that remains undervalued simply because most people have never been taught to recognize it. Next up, a gemstone collectors buy not for fire, but for something rarer, a color that feels impossible to name and even harder to replace. Ranked 4th, Kornerupine, the collector gem that looks like a secret. Some gemstones win attention through power. Ruby does it through red. Paraiba does it through neon. Alexandrite does it through transformation. But there is another kind of gemstone value that becomes stronger as collectors mature. A gemstone that doesn't shout. A gemstone that doesn't need a famous name. A gemstone that looks like it belongs to someone who knows what they're doing. That is exactly what Kornerupine is. In 2026, Kornerupine is quietly being accumulated by collectors not because it is trendy, but because it sits in a very rare position in the gemstone world. It is both uncommon and difficult to replace at high quality, yet still largely invisible to the mainstream market. Kornerupine is not a stone most people grow up hearing about. It is not pushed by jewelry chains. It is not commonly listed in the top 10 gemstones people think they know. And that lack of familiarity is precisely what makes it attractive to serious collectors. Because collectors don't just collect rarity, they collect separation. Kornerupine separates itself immediately through color. At its best, Kornerupine appears in shades of deep olive, forest green, smoky green-brown, or muted green with a soft golden undertone. It can look like a gemstone version of aged military canvas, antique glass, or an old museum artifact. It has a tone that feels adult, not playful, not loud, not fashion-driven. And that aesthetic aligns strongly with the 30 to 65 US collector mindset, especially among buyers who have moved beyond the obvious classics and are now collecting stones that signal taste rather than status. But Kornerupine's real strength is not just color, it is structural scarcity. The mineral exists, but gem-quality Kornerupine, stones that are clean enough, saturated enough, and cut well enough to be jewelry grade, is rare. Many Kornerupines are too dark. Many are too included. Many have color that looks muddy rather than rich. And some show pleochroism that can either enhance beauty or ruin it depending on the cut. This means the market does not behave like mass gemstones. It behaves like a collector category. A small number of high-quality stones exist, and once they enter private collections, they tend to disappear. And that is exactly the kind of supply behavior that creates quiet buying in 2026. There is also a deeper collector psychology behind Kornerupine. This is a gemstone that is difficult to explain quickly. That sounds like a disadvantage, but to collectors, it is an advantage. Because gemstones that require explanation tend to be owned by people who enjoy expertise. They enjoy the conversation. They enjoy the "what is that" moment. Kornerupine produces that moment consistently. A well-cut Kornerupine can resemble tourmaline, sapphire, or even chrysoberyl at a glance. But once the light moves, the stone reveals a distinctive internal mood, an earthy richness that feels unlike the clean, commercial look of mainstream gems. It feels geological. It feels real. And in 2026, geological realism is becoming a stronger value driver than polished perfection. There is also a design factor. Modern jewelry designers, especially those working in minimal, architectural, or vintage-inspired styles, are increasingly attracted to stones that are not visually obvious. Kornerupine fits perfectly into that world. It pairs beautifully with yellow gold, antique cuts, and settings that emphasize depth over sparkle. And when designers start using a stone consistently, collectors follow, not loudly, not immediately, but steadily. When collecting gemstones, which feels more valuable long-term, a stone that everyone recognizes instantly, or a stone that only experienced collectors recognize. Because Kornerupine sits right on that dividing line. Kornerupine ranks at number 4 because it represents one of the most important collector signals in 2026. A gemstone that has not been mass-marketed, but has already been quietly adopted by people with the strongest long-term taste. And when taste moves first, value usually follows later. Next up, a gemstone category that looks almost too soft to matter, until collectors realize it is becoming a new kind of modern classic. Ranked third, Vesuvianite. The green gem collectors buy when emerald becomes too complicated. There is a moment that happens in almost every serious gemstone collection. At first, the collection is built on names: ruby, sapphire, emerald. The classics, because the classics feel safe. But then something changes. The collector stops buying names and starts buying structure. That is where Vesuvianite, also known as irreplaceable, enters the story in 2026. This gemstone is not famous, it is not widely marketed, and it is rarely shown in mainstream jewelry stores. But among informed collectors, Vesuvianite has become one of the most quietly respected green gemstones because it offers something the green market desperately needs right now: a distinct green identity without the complications that surround emerald. Emerald is iconic, but it is also one of the most difficult gemstone categories to navigate at a serious level. Treatments, oiling levels, fracture filling debates, origin premiums, clarity expectations, and price compression all create friction. For experienced collectors, that friction becomes exhausting. And when collectors become exhausted by a category, they don't stop collecting green. They rotate. They search for a green stone that still feels geological, still feels rare at quality, but does not require a full legal contract of explanation. Vesuvianite is one of the best answers. At its best, Vesuvianite can show a clean, saturated green that feels surprisingly emerald adjacent, but with a different personality. Instead of emerald's slightly bluish, watery glow, Vesuvianite often carries a warmer, earthier green, a green that feels mineral-rich, like it was pulled from a mountain rather than polished into a luxury symbol. It doesn't imitate emerald, it stands next to it. And that difference matters, because collectors in 2026 are increasingly drawn to gemstones that feel like they have their own identity, not gemstones that exist as substitutes. Vesuvianite is also a stone that rewards close observation. Under magnification, fine examples can show a clean internal structure with subtle depth, less chaotic than emerald, but still distinctly natural. When cut well, Vesuvianite can display crisp brilliance and a refined glow that feels understated rather than flashy. And that understated performance is becoming a collector preference, not because collectors want less beauty, but because they want more control. In an era where many gemstone categories are dominated by extreme pricing, hype, or heavy marketing, Vesuvianite feels like a stone that exists outside the noise. Now, the reason it ranks this high in 2026 is not because Vesuvianite is suddenly popular. It is because high-quality Vesuvianite is genuinely difficult to obtain. Most Vesuvianite in the market is either too dark, too included, too brown, too dull, or simply not cut to maximize its potential. Collector-grade Vesuvianite, stones with strong green saturation, good clarity, and a clean, balanced cut, is rare in a way that doesn't show up in mainstream search results. It is the kind of rarity that only becomes visible when someone actually tries to build a collection around it. And that is the kind of rarity collectors trust. There is also an important psychological advantage. Vesuvianite is a gemstone that looks expensive, without triggering the emotional resistance that expensive gemstones often create. When people see a fine emerald, the first thought is often, how much is it? Is it treated? Is it real? Is it worth the risk? When people see a fine Vesuvianite, the reaction is different. What is that? And that question is the beginning of collector desire, because curiosity is the strongest entry point into a niche category. And in 2026, niche categories are where quiet buying happens. When it comes to green gemstones, which matters more long-term, the most famous name, or the stone with the clearest identity and the least controversy? Because that question explains why Vesuvianite is rising. Vesuvianite ranks at number 3 because it represents the collector rotation happening right now, away from complicated prestige and toward clean, under-recognized structure. Next up, a gemstone with one of the most powerful origin stories in the United States. A stone so geographically limited that its entire future can be traced to a single region. Ranked second, Benitoite. America's rarest collector gem, hiding in plain sight. Every collector eventually reaches a point where the question changes. It stops being, what gemstone is the most valuable? And becomes, what gemstone is the most specific? Because specificity is where true collecting begins. And in 2026, few gemstones offer that kind of specificity more cleanly than Benitoite. Benitoite is not just rare, it is geographically precise. It is one of the only gemstones in the world whose identity is inseparable from a single place in the United States, California. And that matters far more than most people realize, especially for a US-based audience. Because American collectors often carry a unique psychology. They value global prestige, but they also value national provenance. A gemstone that is both rare and distinctly American has a different kind of gravitational pull. Benitoite is the official state gem of California, but that fact alone doesn't explain why collectors are quietly buying it. The real reason is more compelling. Benitoite behaves like a closed category. The historic Benitoite gem mine in San Benito County has produced the most famous material, but production has never been large. Fine stones have always been limited, and unlike categories such as sapphire or tourmaline, where new deposits can appear in different countries, Benitoite does not have a broad global safety net. Its supply is narrow, its identity is fixed, and its best material is already largely spoken for. That combination creates one of the most collector-friendly structures in the gem world. But scarcity alone does not make a gemstone collectible. The stone has to perform, and Benitoite performs in a way that surprises almost everyone who sees it for the first time. At high quality, Benitoite displays a vivid blue that can feel electric, often compared to sapphire, but with a slightly different personality. Some stones lean toward a clean, bright cornflower tone. Others show a deeper, more saturated blue that feels concentrated rather than velvety. And then there is the trait that turns curiosity into obsession. Benitoite has exceptional fire. It produces strong dispersion, those spectral flashes that people associate with diamonds. But in a blue gemstone, that fire feels almost unnatural. It creates a visual contradiction, a calm, saturated blue with explosive internal flashes. That combination is rare, and collectors love rare contradictions. Another reason Benitoite is quietly rising in 2026 is that it sits at the intersection of two collector worlds, the world of gemstone collectors and the world of mineral specimen collectors. Benitoite is famous in both circles, and when a gemstone belongs to both categories, it tends to develop a deeper base of long-term demand. Even when jewelry trends shift, specimen collecting remains stable. That dual demand structure creates resilience. It also makes Benitoite easier to sell or trade within collector communities because it has multiple audiences who understand it. But perhaps the most powerful factor in 2026 is psychological. Benitoite is one of the few gemstones that feels like a discovery. Even among jewelry enthusiasts, many have never heard the name. That means it still carries the thrill of novelty, without being a new unstable category. It is not a modern marketing invention. It is a real documented gemstone with a real geographic anchor. And that anchor matters. Because when collectors grow skeptical of vague origin claims in mass market narratives, they gravitate towards stones whose identity cannot be blurred. Benitoite cannot be blurred. It is too specific. It is too rare. And its story is too clean, which makes a gemstone more collectible long-term, a stone with worldwide recognition, or a stone that is tied to one place so tightly that no new replacement supply can ever appear. Because that question is exactly why Benitoite keeps climbing. Benitoite ranks at number 2 because it represents a collector ideal, a gemstone with real beauty, real rarity, and a supply structure that feels permanently limited. And now there is only one gemstone left, a gemstone that collectors buy not because it's rare, but because it is instantly understood across generations. A stone whose value doesn't need to be explained, it is simply recognized. In first place, Star Sapphire, the gem that explains itself in 1 second. In the collector world, the most valuable gemstones are not always the rarest. They are often the ones that do something no other gemstone can do. Something that can be understood instantly, even by someone who knows nothing about gemology. That is why Star Sapphire takes the number 1 position in 2026. Because Star Sapphire doesn't need education to create desire. It doesn't need a lecture about origin. It doesn't need a debate about treatment. It doesn't need an explanation of rarity tiers. It simply needs light. And when the light hits correctly, the gemstone produces one of the most powerful optical phenomena in the natural world, a floating star. This effect, called asterism, is created when microscopic needle-like inclusions inside the sapphire align in precise directions. When cut into a high dome cabochon, those internal structures reflect light as a star, usually with 6 rays, sometimes 12 in rare cases. And here is the critical collector truth. A star sapphire is not judged by its name. It is judged by performance. In 2026, collectors are quietly shifting toward performance-based gemstones, stones that prove themselves without relying on reputation. Star Sapphire is the perfect example, because the difference between an average star sapphire and a collector-grade star sapphire is enormous. Most star sapphires on the market have one or more weaknesses. The star is weak or blurry, the rays are uneven, the center drifts away from the top, the body color is too dark, the dome is too low, the polish is poor, or the stone looks cloudy instead of alive. Collector-grade star sapphire is the opposite. The star is sharp, the rays are clean, the center is stable, the dome is high, the body color is rich but still translucent enough to glow, and the stone has presence, like an object that was designed rather than mined. This is where the category becomes quietly dangerous in 2026. Because once collectors learn what top tier actually looks like, they realize something uncomfortable. High-grade star sapphires are far rarer than the market treats them. The supply exists, but true quality is thin. And unlike many gemstone categories, star sapphire cannot be optimized easily after the fact. Cutting matters, yes, but the star's sharpness and stability depend on the internal silk structure. If the silk isn't there, no cutting can create it. If the silk is too heavy, the stone becomes dull. If it is too light, the star disappears. The phenomenon is fragile, and fragile phenomena create collector scarcity. There is also an important psychological advantage that star sapphire holds over nearly every other gemstone in the world. It is one of the few gems that remains equally compelling across generations. A young person can see it and feel the magic. An older collector can see it and appreciate the mineralogical precision. It satisfies both emotion and expertise. That dual appeal creates something extremely rare in the collector market: cross-generational liquidity. In other words, the stone is not only desirable, it is easily understood. And in uncertain markets, easily understood assets tend to hold attention longer than assets that require specialized knowledge. This is why star sapphire quietly strengthens in 2026. Not because it is new, because it is timeless. There is also a display factor that makes it uniquely powerful for collectors. Star sapphire is one of the few gemstones that looks better in motion. Most gemstones are photographed. Star sapphire is demonstrated. A small rotation under a light is enough to create a reaction, because the star moves across the surface like a living object. That makes it one of the most showable gemstones in any collection. Collectors love stones that can be shown without words, and star sapphire is exactly that. But the final reason it ranks number one is deeper. Star sapphire is a gemstone that represents certainty. In a world where many gemstones have become complicated, heated versus unheated, oiled versus untreated, origin disputes, synthetic debates, market hype, star sapphire offers a simpler form of value, a phenomenon that either appears or it doesn't. And when it appears perfectly, it becomes unforgettable. If a gemstone can create a visible phenomenon with no explanation, does that make it more collectible than a gemstone that is simply rare? Because star sapphire forces that question in the most direct way possible. Star sapphire takes the number one position not because it is the rarest gemstone on Earth, but because it is one of the few gemstones that can create instant belief. A floating star inside a natural stone, and in 2026, collectors are quietly buying belief. Not just beauty. Not every gemstone will matter in 2026. Some remain visible because they're famous. But the stones collectors quietly buy tend to share one trait. They're difficult to replace at high quality and unmistakable once seen in real life. Which gemstone on this list felt the most collector grade, and why? Was it performance, rarity, treatment transparency, or pure identity? Because in gemstones, what lasts is rarely accidental. It's structural.